Guru Nation, thank you so much for watching and listening. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share, no matter if you're on YouTube or on the podcast. Proud to announce the YouTube channel is now ad-free. We don't need the extra ad money. We rather have a non-disruptive viewing experience for you guys and gals, and get back to the important things like your questions. So today 2 days ago actually, someone asked me a question. Can you please make a video regarding satellite sites? What would be the major difference regarding regulatory or documentation? Thank you. I appreciate your content. Thank you for the question, the comment. Keep them coming. Listen, this is a complicated topic, so that's why I figured it would be a good one to discuss when I came into the studio today to shoot. This is going to take 20 to 30 minutes to break it down. But there's two ways to look at satellite sites, right? And there's, depending on how you define it, and there's no real definition here. It's kind of colloquially used amongst sponsors and sites. Not all sponsors are okay with it. The way I define a satellite site is one PI and multiple locations for the same PI. Now, obviously, you have to justify to the sponsor why you're setting up that way and why you did set up that way. There's another definition that's, I think, inappropriate or incorrect, which is two sites, but two different PIs, but the same company. And those are more like site networks. And those are not satellite sites, because the way I have always been taught and the way I think makes the most sense is a satellite site is just another location, but just like a real satellite, right? It revolves around the main site. So I think sharing examples is a better way to understand these things. And then we'll get into all the regulatory stuff. SOPs come into play here. CLIA waivers come into play. Lab search, staffing. I mean, everything comes into play. So you have a study, and I actually have a situation like this right now. I have plenty of studies where satellite sites make the most sense for us to use. So let me just rewind a little bit and explain our setup here at Yuma Clinical Trials. At Yuma Clinical Trials, we have what's called the hub and spoke model. So we have the parent company, Yuma Clinical Trials, and then we have different specialists' clinics all across town. So the hub is our main site, Yuma Clinical Trials, the main hub. And then we have each spoke is each individual specialist or different PI. We employ the hub and spoke model because each specialist clinic doesn't always have, generally it's space. So doesn't always have enough space for us to do studies. Having a research site, doing a research study takes up a lot of space. This is one of the things, I think it's a very underrated thing that people can't grasp. There are so many boxes you receive for lab equipment, lab kits, ECGs, patient-reported outcomes. My business partner, Brad Hightower, made a interesting, like a TED Talk style video where he presented how many ePros, patient-reported outcomes, devices are given to sites just for one study. And there's stacks of these things, and that's just one study. And then you have, just repeat that with however many studies you have. So most doctors' offices, and ours here in Yuma are no different, don't have the space to do more than like one or two studies. And sometimes they don't even have the space to do one. So, but the patients still go there because that's still a clinic. The patients go there when it makes sense for them to go there. And then they go to the hub when it makes sense for them to go there. And then monitors, same thing. There's not always room for monitors to monitor at the clinic. So they go to the hub. And this is kind of how satellite sites evolved. And if you look at the 1572 form and you look at one of the sections, it says, what is the main address of the site, name and address of the site. But then there's place for additional locations, satellite locations. And this comes into play now almost on every study that we have because we employ the hub and spoke model. So we have a study that we are, for example, a sleep study. Our PI for that study is a sleep specialist. He's board certified pulmonologist and sleep medicine. So we got this sleep study where 2 nights of the study are overnight stays at the sleep clinic, but then it becomes a 25-week study outpatient. So it doesn't make sense to only do the study at that sleep location because that place is not equipped to be an actual site. It's equipped to be a sleep center, a sleep lab. And so that's an additional location on our 1572. Our main hub is the main location. And when patients do the sleep portion of the study, they will go to that location. When patients do the regular outpatient visits, they will come to our hub and spoke model. So they're going to come screen at our hub and spoke. They're going to come get labs, everything, get qualified, ECG, all those usual assessments at our main location. When it's time for them to go spend 2 nights in the sleep center, they're going to go and we're going to meet them approximately 2 miles away from our hub at the sleep lab where the PI is there, his staff are there, but we also go, we being our site staff, go to make sure that the study's being done according to protocol. And some of our staff even stay overnight in these cases because protocols require that you're supervising overnight. So that's considered a satellite site in our case. Now, there's another example of this where it's maybe a little more complicated, but I don't think so, because you're utilizing 2 different investigators. So we are getting a study for hot flashes, okay? And the PI is an internal medicine doctor because he sees a whole bunch of patients. He's one of Yuma's biggest private practices, sees a whole bunch of patients, and many of them do have hot flashes, postmenopausal women with hot flashes. Now, this study also requires an OBGYN to do a certain assessment. And I'm not going to get into detail what that assessment is, but it's an outpatient procedure that only OBGYN doctors typically do, but they do it in their own office. So for this study, in order for us to be able to do it, I went to my PI, my internal medicine doc, and I said, hey, you've got a lot of patients for this study. Yes, I do. You think we can do it? Yes, we can. No problem. All right, perfect, doc. There's only one caveat. We need this procedure done, and I know it's only done by OBGYNs. Do you have any colleagues around town that would potentially be interested? So he said, yes, I do. Contact so-and-so. We set it up. Dr. So-and-so is now our sub-investigator for this study. And his site, his location, his office, really, it's not a site, but for the purposes of research, it is a satellite site. His office now becomes a satellite site, and his address goes on the 1572 under additional locations. The majority of the visits are done at our hub, which is the internal medicine physician's office. But the assessments that are required in OBGYN and specialized equipment that are only at OBGYN offices are done at our satellite location. So only one PI, right, which is our internal medicine doc, and then the sub-investigator is the OBGYN. And to make things even more complex, we have a third location for this study because remember I said we have a hub and spoke. Well, our PI in this scenario, he's an internal medicine doc. We are using his clinic as the main place where patients will be seen. We're using the OBGYN's clinic for those assessments. But we like the flexibility because our internal medicine doctor also doesn't have that much space. We like the extra flexibility of having additional options, additional storage space, if we choose to store drug at our hub. Also, if monitors want to come monitor from our hub instead of the doctor's clinic, that's more comfortable. So in this study, we have one main location and two satellite sites. We have our hub, which in this example, no patients will actually be seen there, but they can if we wanted to. But it's more for storing lab kits, storing supplies. Monitors can come monitor there. Then we have the doctor's clinic, the PI's actual clinic, where we can still store drug and a few things because his clinic does have enough space. And then we have the OBGYN's clinic where there's no space, only one assessment's done, and that's it. But that's our setup for this study. Now, if it made sense to add another location, let's say we needed another assessment that only another specialist could do. We would just have another satellite site for this location. So now we get into SOPs because sponsors are okay with all this stuff as long as you have rationale for why. Sponsors don't want excessive amounts of satellite sites. It's just, to them, it's a regulatory nightmare. And also for the sites, it can get kind of confusing as to why you're having so many locations. But as long as you have rationale for why and justification for why and you present it, sponsors are going to ask you a lot of times, well, you know, what's your SOP for this kind of things? Like, where will the IP be held? And in this particular study that I'm discussing, the IP can be held at the PI's, the internal medicine's clinic, because we do have a drug room there. But not all of our PIs have enough space at their clinics for storing drug. So therefore we store drug at our hub. So sponsors may ask, well, do you have a SOP for transporting investigational product? Or how do you plan on handling that when it's time to dispense IP? And that's where your justification comes in. Some sites put in the SOP that they will have a transportation log for when they transport investigational product from one location to another for the purpose of dispensing. Other sites will have an SOP where patients will, on days of dispensing, will need to come to the location where the IP is held in order to be dispensed, or a combination of the two. Your SOPs can be flexible, and they should be flexible. But sponsors just want to know how you're going to handle it, what's going on, what's going to be the process, what's going to be the procedure. So as long as you can explain these things to them, it's fine. Now, there's regulatory issues. I kind of discussed one with the standard operating procedure. So you may want to have an SOP for satellite sites and how you maintain satellite sites. You may want to have an SOP for when CLIA waivers are needed and when they're not needed. In the case of our study that I discussed, our PI, remember the internal medicine doctor, we have a CLIA waiver for his location. And then our sub-I, he has a CLIA waiver for his location as well. If he didn't, we may, as a site, need to consider, and we would have to talk to the sponsor, do we require a CLIA waiver for that site? And we would have to get into the regulations of what's actually being done. If it's an assessment that doesn't involve biological samples or lab samples, you may not need one. Is this considered a lab sample or is this considered a procedure? Those all play into whether you need a CLIA waiver. To make it simple, I always get a CLIA waiver for every single investigator that works for us. And that just makes it easy. Most doctors already have CLIA waivers. Typically psychiatrists don't, pulmonologists don't, but any clinic that draws blood probably has a CLIA or a CLIA waiver. But if they don't, you may need to consider getting one and paying the bill for that as a site. Now there's also things like AIDA, collecting and shipping hazardous goods, biological samples, which are labs. Depending on who does that, usually it's your coordinators or your research assistants. You need to get a CLIA waiver for all those staff that are going to be involved. If you are going to use any staff from the satellite location, they probably need to have good clinical practice as well. Typically what we do is we don't have any of the staff that are not our own staff employed by Yuma Clinical Trials do any of the work. The only people doing actual assessments for the study are people that are employed by Yuma Clinical Trials. So the physicians, medical assistants, for example, no. Now sometimes there is some overlap because there are situations like in the sleep study, the previous one I mentioned. You need like sleep techs, you need like certified sleep techs that only they know. It's a very specialized knowledge of how to operate the equipment. They may need GCP, and in those cases, you would have to put them on GCP. They may need to be on the delegation log. That part's up to the sponsor. And they may also need protocol training and things like that. Now, if I can avoid that, I do. But in certain cases where it's only very specialized knowledge of the equipment and the PI feels more comfortable with their staff doing it, I let them do it. We just make sure that they do their GCP. And then you got to stay on top of those staff because they're not your staff. So they're not really working for you. But you do have to stay on top of them and say, listen, I need you to do your GCP. I need you to do the protocol training or whatever the case may be. Sometimes it's not, hopefully it's not full protocol training if they're just doing one small specific procedure. The OBGYN, who's the sub-I on my study that I brought up, he will have to do GCP. He will have to do, he'll have to be on the DOA log. He's going to have to sign a financial disclosure form as a sub-investigator. And quite honestly, that's no different than if he were actually a sub-I at one location. Let's say we were able to do everything under one roof. That sub-I would still have to fill out and sign all these forms and do all these trainings. So there's time and place where the location doesn't matter. It's the staff. But then there's time and place where, well, having multiple locations and multiple satellite sites makes the most sense. Now, there's even another layer of complexity, which in my hub and spoke model at my site, Yuma Clinical Trials, we have the main LLC, which is Yuma Clinical Trials, and then for three different investigators for now, we created small LLCs for whatever studies we get that they are the PI on. So if one of the specialists is going to be a PI on a study, we do it under their LLC, where Yuma Clinical Trials usually owns 75% of it. and that PI owns 25% of it. And I've discussed this in a business, how I set up my business structure for my site in a previous episode. But in those cases, you technically are using a different LLC for them, for those PIs. But all the staff is Yuma Clinical Trials. The SOPs are Yuma Clinical Trials. The CLIA waivers are held in the LLC names. Obviously, the medical licenses are held in the PI's names. But in those cases, I had to write a note to file, and we just give it to all the sponsors when it's a new study, what the structure is. The Yuma Clinical Trials is the parent company. We own and operate, and our staff and our SOPs, and we share all the tech and all the platforms. You just have to justify your rationale. And they're going to ask, I get asked this all the time when we're negotiating contract for a new sponsor, because we're Yuma Clinical Trials, but the payee is going to be a different LLC depending on who's the PI. And so we just have to share this memo to file again and explain, yeah, this is Yuma Clinical Trials is the parent company, but the contract should be under the name of the LLC. But on the 1572, it's both. The LLC of the specialist and then Yuma Clinical Trials as the parent company. And as far as regulations, I mean, obviously there's local things you've got to figure out based on your local jurisdictions. Do you need a business license for each location? Most of the time, each doctor's office has their own business license anyways, so you can kind of piggyback off themselves. Matter of fact, our internal medicine doctor, he has his own CLIA waiver under his private practice, and we have a CLIA waiver for our main site anyways, but a different address. So we have two CLIA waivers in his case, because he's got his own and we have our own. So it allows us to draw blood at multiple locations. And so those are the kind of the bigger things you need to worry about. SOPs, CLIA waivers or CLIA certificates, training of staff, IATA, GCP, obviously licenses, business licenses, contracts and budgets. That's satellite sites broken down in a digestible format. It really shouldn't be more complicated than this. Now, a lot of sites maybe make it more complicated. A lot of sponsors make it more complicated than it needs to be. But in reality, it's just, you have to think from the perspective of a patient and from a study coordinator. If I'm doing the study at my internal medicine physician's office, but I need a procedure done by an OBGYN once in a while, that's a satellite site. But where's IP going to be stored? Where are the lab kits going to be stored? Typically, those should only be in one place. Like, it would be crazy for our IP to be stored in multiple locations, although it could, because if the IP can be stored anywhere that the 1572s are listed as locations, but does your SOP allow for that? Does your SOP allow for transportation of IP? So for us, it makes no sense to store IP for the same study in multiple locations. It makes sense to keep it in one place. So make sure that wherever you store the IP, you have enough of it, and make sure that you have a transportation log if you're going to be transporting it back and forth, or a justification or an SOP for where patients need to go when they are dispensed the study drug. So everything's justification, everything's rationale for why. Sponsors may be confused, but as long as you provide them rationale and SOP, they're going to know why. I don't think it's that complicated. Let me know if you need more help or if you need further follow-up. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Catch you later. Bye-bye. Hey, if you guys like that kind of content, make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. Stay tuned for more videos.